Thank you to my Asbantium level patron Fallon Cortez for helping to support the channel. The Doctor is one of science fiction's biggest heroes, travelling through space and time, defeating evil villains and saving those in need. But what happens when you take this character and place them in the world of historical fantasy? How can a character like the Doctor cope with being the odd one out in the shadow of a mythical legend? Well, that's the premise of the Doctor Who episode Robot of Sherwood, where the Doctor and Clara meet Robin Hood and his merry men themselves, battling the evil sheriff and space robots. Hang on, I don't remember that part from the stories. Indeed, this story puts a very Doctor Who twist on the iconic tale, giving it dramatic explosions, lasers and spaceships, along with a lot of comedy. But is it good? Does the episode manage to juggle all these concepts and deliver a satisfying, enjoyable Doctor Who story? Well, as always, that's what I'm here to discuss with this analysis. So grab your golden arrow and your merry, definitely heterosexual friends, and let's take a deep dive into Robot of Sherwood.
This is getting silly.
One of the key themes showrunner Stephen Moffat wanted to focus on during Series 8 was the Doctor's heroism, or more accurately, the extent of it. Into the Dalek had already posed the question of whether the Doctor is a good man, so Moffat wanted to follow this up by contrasting the main character with a traditional folklore hero. And of course, who better than Robin Hood, Earl of Locksley and his merry men, who stole from the rich and gave to the poor of England, whilst King Richard the Lionheart was off fighting the Third Crusade. It's a classic British story of noble heroes and black-hearted villains, but the story has always been shrouded in mythology, with historians to this day debating whether it actually has any basis in reality itself. So when it came to writing a story all about a historical figure, regardless of whether they existed or not, Moffat naturally turned to longtime collaborator Mark Gatiss, who had previously written Doctor Who episodes about Charles Dickens and Winston Churchill. I think Gatiss does a fantastic job of adapting the legend of Robin Hood, with no shortage of inspirations for the episode. The title is directly inspired by the 1980s Robin of Sherwood TV show, and many other elements come from the adventures of Robin Hood, the 1938 movie featuring Hollywood heartthrob Errol Flynn. And yes, the episode even makes a weird joke about him.
Errol Flynn! He had the most enormous ego!
Robin is brought to life well by actor Tom Riley, who is a Maidstone lad like myself. However, there will always be part of me that wishes the Doctor Who production team had cast Jonas Armstrong and co from the 2006 to 2008 BBC show. That would have been an amazing crossover, especially because Doctor Who's success was the reason that show existed to begin with. But alas, we can't always get what we want. Robot of Sherwood's merry men may not have crossed over from the amazing yet anachronistic TV show, but they are a very good part of this episode, with their irritating level of over-the-top merriment.
Still not keen on the laughing thing?
Much the Miller was also meant to be involved in the group as per the legends, but he was cut out in early drafts, and that kind of sums up how minor the Merry Men actually are, because they're completely relegated to being side characters who aren't involved outside of the beginning and the end, despite them being such major parts of the Robin Hood story. I mean, it's literally Robin Hood and his merry men, not Robin Hood and his merry men who sometimes show up in the background of a scene maybe. It is a shame that they don't feature a whole lot in the wider episode, but I love the early scene of the Doctor and Clara meeting the band of rogues. Their constant bantering driving the Doctor insane because he refuses to believe that they're real. I think it's very much in line for the Doctor to be so skeptical, especially in this incarnation. Maybe the 11th Doctor would have been all over this and run around gleefully soaking up the atmosphere, but 12 is so obsessed with logic and rationality that he needs answers.
If you were real, you'd be dead in 6 months.
I am real.
Fine.
To him, everything seems too perfect, too fairy tale, and too much like a story. So it's nice how he's constantly trying to catch people out on not being real, because he refuses to admit he's wrong. It's like a more comedic version of his stubbornness in Into the Dalek. He's so determined to prove that Robin is fake or some kind of trick that they end up having a delightful buddy cop dynamic throughout the episode.
Execute him I'd like to see if his head keeps laughing when you chop it off!
Gatiss didn't go into Robot of Sherwood with the intent to make it a heavily comedic romp, but it still ended up becoming a very humorous episode full of jokes and wit, never taking itself too seriously. I feel like this is shown with the Doctor and Robin, who are a fun double act constantly trying to one-up each other and have the final say. It's jarring in the best way, with the Doctor's seriousness and Robin's ridiculous optimism clashing spectacularly as they verbally dance for control.
Oh god, I think he soiled himself.
Their constant back and forth interactions, such as them competing at archery and fighting on a bridge, reminds me a lot of this line from Dalek.
Blimey, you can smell the testosterone.
They spend so much time in the episode measuring their King Richards that it makes for some delightful comedy. Some people read these interactions as the pair competing over Clara, but I more see it as them both being obsessed with being the hero of the story itself. They each want to hog the spotlight, which is why they hate each other so much, because they're simply competition for one another. In the dungeon, they're arguing over who should be considered the ringleader and get interrogated because they both have this pompous sense of self-importance ingrained within their heavy egos. The script is absolutely perfect for Peter Capaldi, who is amazing at this kind of sarcastic put-down comedy. The Doctor undermining Robin and belittling him to great effect. There's such a lack of self-awareness from the character, not realising that Robin is basically himself, a charming rogue saving the day and delivering quips in the face of danger.
When did you start believing in impossible heroes?
Don't you know?
Yes, a core aspect of the story is how similar the Doctor and Robin are despite their hatred for one another. It is surprising how Doctor Who has only ever done like one Robin Hood story before, that being a short trip in 2004, although that story was framed in the form of a fictional Doctor Who serial. It was all meta and trying to be clever. And of course there was a plan for season 16 to have a serial revealing Robin Hood to be a bad guy, but I already talked about that in my Unmade Stories series, so watch that if you're interested in learning about it. But anyway, what I mean is that it's strange that it took until series 8 to actually do a Robin Hood story for real. Both the Doctor and Robin Hood are these heroic, larger-than-life figures who left lives of nobility and privilege in order to help the disadvantaged and helpless people around them. It's not really a negative comparison like Rusty in the previous episode. It instead shows how heroic the Doctor still is despite his bitter and unwelcoming exterior, so there's some great comparisons between the two. He brings a spoon to a sword fight, competes in an archery contest, and helps to kickstart a peasant revolt, inspiring the slaves to rise up against their robot masters. So he himself comes across as the same kind of fairy tale impossible hero as Robin himself is. I think it's interesting that at the end, both he and Robin agree that they're not heroes, but they keep pretending to be, and that's what counts. It's like the end of Into the Dalek. They try to be good men, and that's good enough, because they can inspire others and become legends throughout time and space. They become timeless stories, and like the 11th Doctor famously said, we're all stories in the end, so just make it a good one. So, who are the Doctor and Robin fighting? Well, the evil Sheriff of Nottingham and his evil robotic knights, of course. They're an intimidating presence from the get-go, with the Sheriff callously stabbing a dude for speaking up against him. I do like how the knights' true nature isn't immediately shown. They just start off as these imposing figures beside the Sheriff. However, this all changes in the archery scene, which is really well directed by Paul Murphy. Obviously the main attraction is the splitting of the arrows, an iconic part of Robin Hood lore, but in my opinion it truly shines once the chaos and fighting begins, the robots revealing themselves and shooting lasers. It feels epic and intense with all the explosions, so it's a nice outside action piece. Although that does kind of have the consequence of making things a little bit more boring when it all goes back inside the castle, since the action drags a bit more when we're stuck in corridors and bland rooms. However, this is where the great character writing helps to prop things up, because we get to explore the world a bit more, seeing the plight of the slaves and how the robots are brutally killing any peasant who falters even for a minute. These small scenes are good for giving the episode that realistic personal touch, showing us that not everything is about the swashbuckling heroes up above in the lush green forest. We can sympathise with Marion's plight, and the robots' stark lack of compassion gives us a reason to fear them. I do like the twist that the castle is a crashed spaceship and the robots assumed this knight form in order to fit into the surroundings. surroundings. It's a fun excuse for all the chaos and Doctor Who-y goodness, along with providing some answers for all the fairy tale too good to be true stuff, like the forest being so unrealistically green and lush, since it's just radiation spilling from the giant spaceship castle thing. However, one big criticism I do have about Robot of Sherwood, and this wasn't exactly the episode's fault, but it does feel a bit too similar to Deep Breath. The storyline is all about these robots trying to fit into the local surroundings in order to repair their crashed spaceship, and I know it's only a tenuous link, but considering there's only one episode between the two, it makes it a bit of an issue. It could have been even more glaring considering in early drafts there was a mysterious antlered hunter who could control the Merry Men. It would have turned out that this was the spaceship's interface wearing a stag's skull to hide its damaged head. That would have been way too similar to the Half-Faced Man, so I'm glad it didn't make it through the drafts. Ben Miller's Sheriff of Nottingham though is a much better villain. Such a delightfully camp and over-the-top element of the story. He's so comically dastardly and I love it. I've heard some people saying Miller's performance detracts from the episode, but I completely disagree, because the hamminess of it is what makes it so good. Because it fits in with the wider storyline of things being too stereotypically fairy tale and hard to believe. Indeed, the sheriff was meant to be revealed as a robot too, explaining his presence in the narrative because he's another robot playing his role as a villain to oppress the locals. Originally this would be revealed through a beheading, but this had to be changed because of ISIS beheading 2 journalists not long before broadcast. Obviously that change was important because of how topical the tragedy was, but it does have the unfortunate side effect of removing the twist of the sheriff being a robot, since instead he just falls into molten gold and dies. There is some vague dialogue alluding to him being part robot, but it's blink and you'll miss it, which is a shame.
First of a new breed, half man, half engine!
Having this payoff is a necessary element of the story, because of the idea of the ship's database blending in, so for it to not be there despite the reasoning makes the episode lose marks, because it makes things feel a bit disjointed and unresolved as a result. A big question posed throughout Robot of Sherwood is whether Robin Hood himself is actually real.
This isn't a real sandal.
Yes, it is!
Oh, yes, it is.
Right from the beginning of the episode, the Doctor keeps shooting Clara down for wanting to meet the legend, since he's convinced that there's no way for Robin Hood to actually exist. Instead, he'd rather go to the Ice Warrior hives on Mars, or go clubbing with multi-dimensional women. You know, the average Friday night. It's a nice scene for the pair, once again showing their tight friendship and great comedic chemistry. It also shows Clara's growing confidence, pushing the Doctor into granting her wish to meet Robin Hood, and there's even a fun scene as she's identified as the actual leader of the heroic trio, since she's essentially the grown-up of the three. The Doctor and Robin spend so long bickering that it falls to Clara to actually get stuff done, which we see as she meets with the sheriff and uses all the tricks she knows to get him to tell her everything.
After this derby.
Right.
There's a bit of seduction, a bit of playing dumb, a bit of playing smart, and most importantly, a lot of massaging his ego to make him explain his entire plan. It continues to display how she's adopting these Doctor-like characteristics and becoming more involved in adventures, rather than just being like a passenger. I think this makes for a much more interesting dynamic than a lot of other companions, because it gives the Doctor a human equal, someone who can keep pace with him and even outdo him on occasions. She idolises him and wants to become him, which is their overall story arc together, and this episode continues to lay those foundations.
You are her hero, I think.
I'm not a hero.
Sure, Clara gets to have a lot of fun in Robot of Sherwood, but it's another key episode in showing her rapidly growing independence and confidence in her own abilities. It's Clara who convinces Robin to work with the Doctor because she tells him all about the Time Lord, which propels Robin to put aside his differences with the Doctor and help him save the day. So Clara plays a vital role in the episode. When the Doctor discovers that all the knights are robots created by the spaceship in order to fit in, it does seem to validate his belief that Robin himself is a robot too. Like he says, the peasant slaves need a symbol of hope, something to believe in and keep them toiling away, rather than throwing down their tools and accepting death. In a way, it kind of suggests that Robin Hood is a propaganda tool created by the villains, and it does make a lot of sense, although the question then becomes, why actually make him real if he can stop you? Indeed, the Doctor seems to get it all completely wrong, as the sheriff insists Robin isn't part of the plan, Because yeah, it is a stupid idea to create someone to stop your evil scheme. This leads to some nice ambiguity to Robin's true nature, something we never see resolved in this episode or the follow-up book. I really like this because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if Robin is real or not. What matters is what he does and what he represents to the people he protects. He's a legend in both forms of the word, and I think the Doctor comes to respect that a lot. There's a good scene at the end where Robin asks the Doctor if it's true that he's forgotten as a real man in the future. It's telling of Robin's character that he actually embraces this legacy, because it's better and it means he has a bigger impact on the world.
History is a burden. Stories can make us fly.
I mean, just think about it. Myths and legends seem to inspire people a lot more than real history tends to do. I would wager that more people know about the legend of King Arthur than about 90% of other English kings. But there's barely any evidence to suggest that he was ever even real, let alone a hero grabbing swords from lakes and slaying dragons with a wizard by his side. The more a figure is tied to history and grounded in reality, the less imagination they tend to inspire because there's less of a legend there. By being forgotten as a real man, Robin can be anything. He can be whatever someone wants him to be, and there's no history book that can surefire disprove that. Which I think is beautiful in a strange, limitless, imaginative way.
And may those stories never end.
There's actually a sequel of sorts to this story, since the book Return of Robin Hood revisits the setting and the character. It takes the interesting approach of having a previous incarnation of the Doctor encounter an older Robin, since the fourth Doctor, Sarah Jane and Harry find themselves in Sherwood Forest around 20 years after the events of this episode. It's not that much of a sequel since it doesn't really have a whole lot to do with the episode itself, but it takes the story in a nice direction, exploring how Robin has become disillusioned with his fight, and this has put a strain on his relationship with Maid Marian, who almost hooks up with Harry at one point. I do like how the book incorporates King John and Guy of Gisborne, staples of the legend who were missing from Robot of Sherwood, so the novel serves as a good way to bring those characters into the world, especially because Guy of Gisborne is working with an evil Karenite called Mother Maudlin to take over the world. You know, typical Doctor Who stuff. I also find it funny just how much the book hates King Richard, who the Doctor brings in at the last minute to save the day. The writer really doesn't like him, constantly bringing up how much of a failure his crusade and reign were. Obviously, none of it is exactly wrong. Richard did suck as a king and was only ever really good for battles and propaganda, but I just find it funny how much the book despises him. However, despite this, Return of Robin Hood is more of a serious story compared to the very comedic Robot of Sherwood, which is a detriment to the book at times, but it does serve as a satisfying epilogue to the episode, wrapping up the overall Robin Hood legend with the defeat of the villains and allowing Robin and Marian to live happily ever after in Locksley Hall, bringing a conclusive end to everything. Although fittingly, the Doctor never elaborates on what exactly happens to them next, so it keeps them shrouded in myth and legend. Oh, and in case you were wondering, the Karenite wipes the protagonist's memories in Doctor Who's tried and tested memory erasing plot device, so that's why the 12th Doctor has no recollection of the adventure. Oh, and I'd also like to thank my patron Thomas Hibbert for sending me a physical copy of the book. I think the main issue with Robot of Sherwood is that all the comedy kind of papers over a weak plot. I've always thought that Gatiss' episodes suffer from being pretty mediocre, and Robot of Sherwood only really gets away with this because of the fun comedic moments between the protagonists and the acting of it. However, beneath all the humour and impressive visuals lurks a very basic, run-of-the-mill narrative. Sure, Gatiss clearly loves the story of Robin Hood and wants to pay homage to it in an enthusiastic way, but the episode is top-heavy, cramming all the good stuff in at the beginning and then kind of falling apart towards the end with a painful amount of plot holes. People often highlight the Golden Arrow saving the day as being a bad resolution, because it shouldn't be able to fuel the ship or whatever. But I think the main issue with it is that if the gold was so important, why were they offering it as a prize to begin with? Even if it was a trap for Robin, they could have just used, I don't know, silver as the prize, especially because that gold arrow is the only way the antagonists even managed to get their ship into orbit in the first place. I know it's a nitpick, but people do notice these things, and as a writer, Gatiss should have tightened these kinds of flaws up. because when you notice an error so glaring, it takes you out of the episode. If you can make time to write a joke about a Hollywood actor's Johnson, then you can find the time to specify that the arrow is silver and create a better, more satisfying ending, especially considering Marion just shows up at the end after being a random side character throughout, and we're meant to be like, oh my god, it's Marion, despite it being tacked on like an afterthought. I know it sounds like I'm being overly critical of some very minor points of a fun, comedic episode, but it's little details like these that make a big difference in how episodes are received and remembered. It sets the Gatises and Chibnalls apart from the Davises and Moffats of Doctor Who, so I do think it's important to highlight this flaw. But at the end of the day, the truth is that Robot of Sherwood isn't designed to be analysed and broken down like this. That's not the point of the episode. It's meant to be more of a standalone, fun refresher after a run of heavy and complex episodes. Coming off the back of Into the Dalek and Deep Breath, Robot of Sherwood is there to show a more humorous side of the 12th Doctor, and contrast him against the overly optimistic and cheery hero that is Robin Hood. And it achieves this well. There's a lot of funny moments throughout the story with wonderful character dynamics and a campy villain to tie it all together. Robot of Sherwood displays that kind of delightful silliness we all know and love about Doctor Who. It's one to put on during lunch or if you need a quick pick-me-up after a stressful day. It doesn't challenge you to think really hard or force you to navigate ethical and moral dilemmas. Sure, those kind of themes are still there, with the Doctor and Robin's sense of heroism being explored, but the main purpose of the episode is just to have fun. Therefore, I would put Robot of Sherwood at the B tier of the Series 8 tier list. The plot may be flimsy, but it's fun, and that's what matters the most. You get swashbuckling heroes, maniacal villains, and a sense of levity tying the ridiculousness together. Robot of Sherwood isn't a Doctor Who classic. It will never be the best episode, but it doesn't need to be, and it instead stands as proof of why the show is so entertaining, because the variety offers up so many unique and wonderful stories everyone can enjoy. But of course, now that we've got the mindless fun out of the way, it's time to get back to the real good stuff. See you next time. And a special thank you to my Asbantium level patron Fallon Cortez, my Platinum level patrons Maximilian Foreman and Nick's Games, and my Gold level patrons Boots, Calvin, Daniel Shillito, Franz Horn aka Line Vortex, Herna Verzog, and Tom Azar. Thank you so much for your support.